Even in a simple photograph like this one, the upper Arroyo Grande Valley, there are hints as to our past. In this oval, Francis Branch's adobe ranch house once stood. More than 100 years later, the agriculture that Branch had begun would be carried on by the Akeda brothers. This is their equipment shed. And somewhere in between, built in 1888, is my alma mater, Branch School. But the beginnings of agriculture in our valley go back to Francis Branch, a Yankee ranchero, born in Scipio, New York. He'd been a Great Lakes boat captain, a mountain man, and a grocer in Santa Barbara before he and Manuela Carlon, his wife, came to the valley in 1837. He brought his mountain man rifle with him, which was wise because the valley was populated by grizzly bears, hundreds of them. And their favorite snacks, of course, were Mr. Branch's calves. Branch had maybe a little bit of a romantic streak. He determined one day to pick fresh blackberries for Manuela. He went into the blackberry bush and made what would be called today a U-turn, because there were 6 grizzlies therein already helping themselves to the fruit. Lincoln's law partner once said that the young lawyer's ambition was like a little engine that knew no rest. Well, the same could have held true for this man, Francis Branch. It gradually quadrupled the size of his San Luis Obispo County landholdings. Diversified. He was a farmer, not just a cattle rancher. His prized possession was a corn sheller shipped around Cape Horn. He was a county supervisor and, of course, was a subscriber to the 1858 Vigilance Committee. This was his adobe that stood on the hill just below Branch School. The cracks are from the 1857 Fort Tejon quake, a 7.9 whopper, centered in Parkfield. The Branches would have employed nannies, cooks, gardeners, cobblers, and so on, but the most important element in terms of profit for the rancho were men like these, vaqueros. And here are some of the tools of their trade. The upper right, that's a bosal bridle, a bitless bridle. On lower left, if a calf got into the monte, the scrub would cut you to pieces unless you were wearing chaps. And in the upper right, maybe the most important tool, the riata, or lariat, that the cowboy carried. 102 years after Branch's time, Dorothea Lange took this photograph of a cowboy on Los Osos Valley Road, and he has the same elements. The riata on his saddle, a bosal bridle, and he's wearing chaps. He would have recognized instantly any cowboy from Branch's time. These were superb horsemen. This guy will give you a little bit of a demonstration of how to head a steer. The best example of more recent vaquero horsemanship was with this woman. This is Sheila Varian of Corbett Canyon. She learned vaquero horsemanship from another woman, Sid Spencer, who ran Herefords and raised Morgan horses on her Lopez Valley Ranch. This is Sheila at the Cow Palace in 1961. She's riding her Arab mare, Montesa, who was the daughter of a great Polish champion. It was Sheila in the finals against 20 men. It was Montesa against 20 quarter horses. They won the championship that year. Branch's vaqueros were either mestizo, mixed Indian and European blood, or descendants of the first people in the valley, Northern Chumash or Yaktichuk Telini, people of the moon. Shocking to us, not until the gold rush did they raise cattle for their meat. Their tallow, and even more so their hides, they were called California dollars. June was a terrible time to be a cow on Branch's rancho. That's when they were slaughtered, skinned. Their hides would be stretched out on wooden pegs on the ground and occasionally soaked in seawater until they assumed the consistency of plywood. Here you see sailors carrying these California dollars down to longboats, which will in turn return to their brigs. And those hides from Arroyo Grande will someday become shoes in a New England factory like the one on the right. You did not see old vaqueros, nor did you see many who had somehow escaped injury. Working with horses can be dangerous, so their lives were dangerous. The reward was, which shocked the puritanical Richard Henry Dana, who sadly never visited his Nipomo distant cousin. The pain was offset by the fact that these people knew how to enjoy themselves. Parties were frequent, fiestas, that's when the cattle were eaten, and there's nothing that California men prided themselves on more than their ability to dance. It might be tempting to romanticize rancho days, but the times were hard as well. That's Mr. Branch's tombstone, a family burying ground in the Upper Valley. He passed away in 1874. The tombstones, the small ones next to his, are of 3 little girls aged 5 to 17, all of them taken by smallpox in the summer of 1862. The fact that they're next to their father speaks volumes of what they meant. There's Branch and there's Manuela. Only 3 of her 11 children outlived her. And then in 1862, a terrible drought hit San Luis Obispo County. It decimated Branch's cattle. He lost the modern equivalent of an estimated $8 million. And he seemed to kind of melt away like his adobe did in this sad watercolor from 1914. But he didn't, of course. The very year that he lost his daughters and the drought hit, Branch kept himself busy by laying out the plan on land he'd donated for Arroyo Grande, California. The next phase of agricultural history, there's nothing that's more pertinent than this little narrow gauge railway like the Pacific Coast Railroad. Branch's town was small. It had a smithy, a general store, and a school, and that was pretty much it. But the character of the town was changing. Thanks to drought and the crash of 1873, the vaqueros began to disappear. By 1880, only 6% of Arroyo Grande's population had Latino surnames. So the likelihood is that many of them left to seek careers elsewhere. Cattle ranching ostensibly, and of course this didn't turn out to be true, seemed to be over forever. And driven by seismic activity, political unrest, a wave of immigrants from the Azores would arrive in San Luis Obispo County in the 1870s and 80s. At first they were shore whalers like their brethren in Hawaii and of course in Boston. But that didn't last long because thanks to Mr. Thomas Edison, the need for their services was soon at an end. So agriculture took a new direction. Both the Azoreans and Italian Swiss immigrants like Joe DeLacy took up dairying, which became enormously popular, brought here by the Steele brothers of Santa Rosa, who bought up much of Branch's Santa Manuela and converted it from cattle raising into dairy farming. Again, from the Bar Museum, you see that milk can and the yoke, like the one that woman is using. She's carrying the equivalent of about 80 pounds. And then there's a creamer in the foreground. By 1880, San Luis Obispo County was #1 in California in the production of cheese and #2 in the production of butter. Even Branch's son Ramon became a dairyman. This is his adobe today. That is the most upset looking cow I've ever seen, but the point being, milking machines, pasteurizers, new processes of making dairy products meant that folks from Arroyo Grande stood to make enormous profits, especially in light of the growth of the two cities to the north and to the south. And getting your butter and cheese to market, thanks again to the little narrow gauge railroad here at Port Harford, was much more practical. From the end of the pier, it would be taken, dairy products, to distant markets, courtesy of ship captains like Marcus Harlow. The railroad also brought a wave of new settlers. Some 60 Civil War veterans took up farming in the Arroyo Grande Valley. 4 of them had fought at Gettysburg. 7 of them had accompanied Sherman on his march through Georgia. 9 had been present when Lee surrendered at Appomattox Courthouse. They did what they knew best, and for a time, until it moved to the East County and the North County, wheat was an important crop here as well. It is said that young Dr. Ed Paulding, an Ohioan fresh out of med school, came to Arroyo Grande on the little Pacific Coast Railway passenger train, looked out the window, and was astonished at the size of our pumpkins. Any town, Paulding reasoned, that could raise pumpkins that big should be able to support a doctor. He was right. But our pumpkins are even famous in the big city. And I found clippings about Arroyo Grande agriculture from newspapers all over the United States. This is from the El Dorado, Kansas Republican in 1894, singing the praises of our tree crops, of our row crops, and even of the hillsides and our rich, juicy grass. The Azorians, the Civil War veterans, the Italians, Swiss, would be succeeded by new waves of immigrants, but these were from East Asia. This photograph was, of course, taken by Dorothea Lange in Guadalupe. Arroyo Grande was, of course, bustling along with the rest of America until, of course, the 1920s. The impact here was devastating. The total value of San Luis Obispo County crops in 1929, and then 4 years later, they'd been halved. To say they were Okies was, of course, a pejorative. There were migrants from Vermont and, of course, from Mexico. When the rains hit in 1936, Muriel Loomis Bennett, given both her family's traditions, was outraged when she heard that little migrant children were coming down with pneumonia in those labor camps on the mesa. She concocted a posse of her friends who contributed great cauldrons of hot soup and stacks of blankets. And Muriel and her son Gordon took those up to the migrant camps to take care of those kids. Clarence Burrell was an extraordinary administrator. There's a football field named after him in San Leandro. But before his San Leandro days, he was the principal of the Arroyo Grande High School. One day a migrant nurse came into his office, and she was hopping mad. She read poor Mr. Burrell the Riot Act. The so-called Okie kids at her migrant camp watched every day as the high school bus paused at the camp gate and then kept going. Burrell understood immediately, to his credit. The next day, the bus stopped at the camp gate, and those kids, those migrant kids, finished the school year as Arroyo Grande Eagles. California Depression hit late, and it stayed later too. This iconic picture should be recognized. We can see the hills beyond Pismo Beach in the distance. And as if the economy weren't bad enough, there was a literal plague of grasshoppers that hit the valley in 1934. Folks driving between Nipomo and Arroyo Grande on Highway 101 had to pull over. Their windshields and their windshield wipers were fouled, covered by thousands and thousands of the greedy little insects which ate everything in their path. It was biblical. This was man-made. Another Lang photograph showing Filipino workers in a pea field. Those hills in Shell Beach are very recognizable today. Peas had been our cash crop for a long, long time, to the point of absurdity. Here are kind of junior versions of Vestal virgins at the Sweet Pea Fair in the Columbia Hall on Branch Street doing their sweet pea dance to honor the crop. Well, when crop prices collapsed, Arroyo Grande farmers did what farmers always do. They worked even harder. The result was soil erosion that looked like this, gulling of these hillsides. The head of the Soil Conservation Service said he had never seen worse soil erosion than that he saw in Arroyo Grande, California. The corrective, 3 years later, would be the Dust Bowl. The New Deal addressed the problem by sending 250 young men, some of them from, of all places, New York City, to build check dams to terrace hillsides to help clear the creek to even fight brush fires. They had a camp built for them where the Women's Club is today, and they were evidently well received by the folks of Arroyo Grande, who threw them a Christmas party. And this iconic photograph of CCC workers was taken just above the Methodist camp. Times changed, and the last WPA project ended when those workers, and you can still see the WPA stamps on Mason Street sidewalks, but those workers were pulled away because there was a sense that war was coming. The surprise would be where it came from. This is home plate from the Gila River internment camp in the Arizona desert, where our neighbors were sent in the summer of 1942, when for 30 days the temperatures stood or hovered above 109 degrees. Kaz Aketa caught behind this plate, now on loan to the Hall of Fame. The Aketas, the Hayashis, the Kobaras, among others, landowners, came back to Arroyo Grande, but many Japanese Americans had been tenant farmers. These are names from the 1942 yearbook, Arroyo Grande Union High School, and I don't recognize them. For a time, the Girls Athletic Association, local businessmen, and the Women's Club went out to work the crops to bring them in. That didn't last long. So a new form of labor in the Bracero program, which ended in 1964, Mexican workers would dominate field work in Arroyo Grande during and long after the war. The Bracero program brought 4 million Mexican nationals into our farm fields. And of course, then, as is today, many of them were documented, some of them were not. In 1954, the Eisenhower administration initiated Operation Wetback. 250,000 Mexican nationals were deported. Here in 1951, 25 were confined to the Huskow. The labor tensions of the 1930s. In the 30s, it had been largely Filipino workers. Now it was Mexican and Mexican-American workers, led by the United Farm Workers, an amalgam of unions that featured both Filipino and Mexican workers. With the strife, though, there was progress. These are some of the crops that are relatively new to our valley. And of course, there's this one. Look at this chart. San Luis Obispo County is in black. That's an astonishing growth in the cultivation of wine grapes. There are new opportunities for the people who work our fields and the larger culture to come together. And that goes both ways, most notably in the Talley family. And our workers, instead of coming from the northern tier of states like Sonora, Chihuahua, Durango, are coming from deep inside Mexico, which offers us, among other things, important to every immigrant group to Arroyo Grande, is they brought their food with them too.